The foundation of silence. My brother stole my legacy, so I buried him in the fine print. They say the most dangerous animal in the world is a man who has nothing left to lose. They're wrong. The most dangerous man is the one who has everything, knows exactly how he got it, and has already predicted the moment you'd try to steal it. My name is Arthur Vane. For 20 years, I was the reliable ghost in the machinery of Vane & Associates, a high-stakes architectural firm founded by my grandfather. My brother, Julian Julians, is the face, the charisma, the man who shook hands and toasted champagne while I stayed in the windowless drafting room, making sure his visionary sketches didn't violate the laws of physics or the local building codes. Julian lived in a penthouse. I lived in a meticulously organized townhouse 3 blocks from the office. Julian drove a Ferrari. I drove a black Volvo, serviced every 6 months to the day. Our father left the firm to both of us in a split trust, but Julian was the managing partner. He was the leader. I was just the engine. And as long as the engine ran, Julian could play the part of the king. But kings eventually get greedy. They stop wanting to share the kingdom with the person who actually built the walls. The betrayal didn't come with a shout. It came with a silver fountain pen and a smirk. It was a Tuesday, 4:00 p.m. Julian called me into the boardroom. He wasn't alone. Sitting next to him was our stepmother, Elena, a woman whose only talent was spending money she hadn't earned, and a team of corporate lawyers I didn't recognize. "Arthur," Julian said, leaning back in his Italian leather chair. His hands were steady, but his eyes were roaming the room, unable to hold mine. "The board has been reviewing the efficiency of the firm. We're moving in a more dynamic direction." I sat down. I didn't reach for the water. I didn't adjust my tie. I just watched him. "Dynamic," I repeated. The word felt like ash. "We're buying out your shares," Elena chimed in, her voice like broken glass wrapped in silk. "At the 2018 valuation. It's more than enough for you to retire, dear. You've worked so hard. You look tired." I looked at the document they slid across the table, a forced buyout clause. It was a legal ambush. They had used a loophole in our father's trust, a clause regarding operational stagnation, to argue that my methodical pace was hindering the firm's growth. They were stripping me of my legacy, my work, and my seat at the table. They wanted me gone so they could liquidate the firm's assets, sell the patents I had spent a decade perfecting, and vanish to the Mediterranean with $300 million. "Sign it, Arthur," Julian said, his voice gaining a predatory edge. "If you fight this, we'll bury you in litigation. You'll be 80 by the time a judge hears the case, and you'll be broke." I looked at Julian. I looked at the shaking hands of the junior associate holding the pen. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply signed. Julian's smirk widened. "Smart man. You always knew when the math didn't add up." I stood up, straightened my jacket, and checked my watch. 4:12 p.m. "The math always adds up, Julian," I said quietly. "You just haven't finished the equation yet." For the next 3 weeks, I was a ghost. Julian and Elena moved fast. They threw a transition gala. They invited the city's elite to celebrate Julian's solo ascent. I watched the clips on social media. Julian was laughing, a glass of vintage crystal in his hand. Elena was wearing a necklace that cost more than my first 3 years of salary. They thought I was mourning. They thought I was sitting in my darkened townhouse, weeping over old blueprints. In reality, I was in a secure facility in Jersey City, meeting with a team of forensic auditors and a specialist in maritime law. See, Julian was a visionary, but he was also lazy. He never read the fine print sections of the contracts I drafted. He found them boring. He called them Arthur's bedtime stories. One of those stories was about the Nexus Project, a massive, state-of-the-art medical research facility we had just broken ground on. It was the jewel of the firm. The contract was worth $80 million alone. But the land for the Nexus Project wasn't owned by Vane & Associates. It was owned by a holding company called Symmetry Holdings. And who owned Symmetry Holdings? Julian didn't know. He never asked. He just saw the name on the lease and assumed it was one of our father's old shells. It wasn't. It was mine. The collapse began on a Monday morning, the day Julian was set to sign the final papers to sell the firm to a private equity group. I walked into the office at 9:00 a.m. The receptionists looked at me like I was a revenant. I didn't stop. I walked straight into the boardroom, where the buyers were waiting with their pens out. Julian looked up, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. "Arthur, what the hell are you doing here? Security is on their way." "Sit down, Julian," I said. The room went cold. I placed a single, thin folder on the table. "The sale of Vane & Associates is predicated on the firm's ownership of its current projects," I said, my voice projecting with a mechanical, terrifying calm. "Specifically, the Nexus Project, which we own," Julian hissed. "You own the blueprints," I corrected. "But you don't own the land. And as of 8:01 this morning, Symmetry Holdings has terminated the lease for the Nexus site due to a breach of the moral turpitude clause in our agreement, specifically the fraudulent removal of a founding partner." The lead buyer from the equity firm paused, his pen hovering an inch above the paper. "A lease termination? On a site that's 30% constructed? The site is now a graveyard of concrete," I said. "And since the project is funded by a federal grant that requires a contiguous lease, The grant is now void. Julian, you owe the federal government $42 million by noon tomorrow. Elena's face went white. The silk was gone. There was only the broken glass. You can't do this. We'll sue you. You can't, I said, because I'm not done. I turned the page in the folder. Julian, you've been using the firm's restructuring fund to pay for your personal expenses. The Ferrari, Elena's jewelry, the penthouse renovations. You coded them as business development, but since I was the one who designed the software for the firm's accounting, I took the liberty of flagging those transactions 6 months ago. I leaned in, my shadow falling over my brother. The IRS is currently sitting in your office, Julian. They aren't there for the architecture. They're there for the tax evasion. Julian tried to stand, but his legs seemed to fail him. He slumped back into his chair, the visionary look replaced by the hollow stare of a man who realized he had walked into a trap he helped build. Wait, Elena stammered, her voice cracking. We can negotiate. Arthur, please, we're family. I looked at her. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel joy. I felt the same cold satisfaction of a bridge that holds exactly the weight it was designed for. Family means sacrifice, I said, echoing Julian's favorite phrase. And today, you're the sacrifice. The aftermath was methodical, absolute. Julian's assets were frozen within 48 hours. The equity firm pulled out of the deal, citing unacceptable legal risk. Vane and Associates declared bankruptcy by the end of the week. Because I held the primary debt through Symmetry Holdings, I bought the firm back for pennies on the dollar during the liquidation sale. I didn't keep the name. I didn't keep the office. I moved the firm to a modest, efficient space in the city. Julian is currently serving 36 months in a minimum security facility for tax fraud. Elena moved back to her home country after her bank accounts were emptied to pay off the federal fines. Last week, I visited the Nexus site. The construction is back on schedule. The lease is secure. The blueprints are perfect. I stood on the edge of the foundation, the wind whipping at my coat. I looked down at the concrete, the solid, unyielding base of everything I had built. Julian always said I was invisible. He was right. You don't notice the foundation of a building when it's standing. You only notice it when it decides to shift. And the math?